Morning began with dust, the fine western dust that lingered in the air as if it had never learned how to settle. When the wagon came to a stop at the ranch gate, the dust still hung in the sunlight, clinging to fabric, to boots, and to glances that had not yet found words. Eden Price stepped down before the driver could offer his hand. She was a black woman, something that did not need explanation. Her dark brown skin stood out against the pale, exhausted earth. Her frame was compact, her back straight, her gaze neither lowered nor defiant. She simply stood there like someone long accustomed to being watched and no longer willing to let that decide her worth. She removed her gloves, folded them carefully, and slipped them into her coat pocket. A small gesture, but one that carried the preparation of someone who knew she would have to take care of herself here. Wyatt Cole waited a few steps away. He had come out earlier than usual, not from eagerness, but because he could not sit still inside a house crowded with numbers that were closing in on him. His ranch was on the edge of foreclosure. The deadline was near. And in this land, a man without a wife, without a family, without a stable foundation, was an easy risk to erase. That was why Wyatt was looking for a wife. Not because of loneliness, not because of love, but because he needed time, and a legal marriage could buy him a little more of it. Wyatt's eyes passed over Eden quickly, then stopped. He had prepared himself to meet a tired woman, one who lowered her head, or at least carried the worry of someone without options. But Eden Price did not match his expectations. She stood calmly as if this harsh land were just another stop along a line of places she had been forced to pass through, not the place that would decide her fate. The handshake was brief. No grip too tight. No effort to seem friendly. Yet in that moment, both of them understood this would not be a simple arrangement. Eden looked around. Not with the curiosity of someone seeing the West for the first time, but with the gaze of someone assessing. She saw the leaning fence, the low wooden roof in need of repair. She saw, too, the tension in Wyatt's stance, like a man long used to holding things up on his own. She knew exactly why she was here. Not because she believed in a romantic future, promised in marriage notices. Eden had come because there was no longer any place where she could stay without bowing her head. In the city, the space left for a black woman grew smaller by the day. Here, at least, the terms were spoken plainly. No pretending, no empty promises. Wyatt led her inside. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath their steps. The interior was clean in the way of a man who lived alone, orderly but missing warmth. Eden removed her hat and set it on the hook by the door, a familiar motion, as if she had done this many times before in many other places. Her gaze stopped at the table in the center of the room. Ledgers lay open, stacked without order. Columns of figures. Ink dark in some places, faint in others. Eden did not need to touch them to know these were not ordinary notes. She stepped closer, bent down, and skimmed a few lines. One beat, then another. Something shifted in her eyes. Not fear, not surprise, but focus deep and steady, like a problem becoming clearer after being studied long enough. Wyatt stood behind her, aware of the silence. He was about to speak when Eden looked up first. This time she looked at him differently, no longer as the woman who had just stepped down from the wagon, but as someone who had realized she had entered a situation far more complicated than what had been stated at the start. She said nothing. She only closed the ledger in front of her gently. Outside, the morning was still thick with dust, but inside that small house something had begun to move. They married on a morning with nothing memorable except its quiet. No music, no flowers. Just a small town room, the smell of old wood, and a few witnesses standing close enough to hear the officiant's voice but not close enough to interfere. Eden stood straight, hands folded at her stomach, her simple dress marked by nothing more than clean stitching. She did not need anyone's sympathy. She only needed this to be done. Wyatt stood beside her, shoulders slightly tense, as if the slightest shift might collide with something fragile. He signed his name quickly, without hesitation, like a man who had been waiting for this moment, but did not want to look directly at it. When it was finished, he gave a brief nod, a small gesture enough to confirm that a new fact had just been set in place. There were no congratulations, no kiss. They left the room like two people who had completed a necessary agreement, not like those beginning a shared life. Eden stepped out first, sunlight resting on her shoulders. Wyatt followed, keeping just enough distance to avoid any suggestion of closeness. On the ride back to the ranch, they spoke very little. The wheels ground against the gravel in a steady rhythm. Eden looked straight ahead, not to avoid Wyatt, but because she was accustomed to not asking for reassurance. This marriage did not need explanation, and she did not want half-formed ones. The first evening passed efficiently. Eden hung her clothes and arranged the few belongings she had brought. Wyatt built the fire and set the kettle on the stove. Movements unplanned, yet never overlapping. They shared the same space like two people long practiced at making room for others. When they sat down to eat, Eden looked up just as Wyatt turned his eyes away, not from coldness but from habit. Eden recognized it immediately, a man unused to being met with a steady gaze, especially by a woman who did not lower her eyes or seek protection. She did not force him to face her. She ate quietly, letting the silence reveal its own rhythm. Night came quickly. Wyatt showed Eden the room at the end of the hall. The door opened, then paused as if he meant to say something, but could not find the right shape for it. Eden rested her hand on the doorframe and gave a small nod. No more was needed. Inside, Eden sat on the edge of the bed and removed her shoes. She listened to Wyatt's footsteps moving farther away. There was no sense of abandonment. Only a fact made clear: they lived under the same roof, but not yet inside the same story. The days that followed moved slowly. Eden rose early. She learned the rhythm of the ranch by watching before intervening. Wyatt left before dawn and returned when the sun was already high. When they crossed paths, it was often in brief moments in the kitchen, on the porch, by the wooden table. Their eyes met, then moved on unhurried. Once Eden bent to pick something up. Wyatt did the same. Their hands brushed lightly. No one pulled away. No one held on. Just a pause long enough for both to register the other's presence in a new way. The silence between them began to change in nature. At first, it had been a necessary distance. Later, it became a space where one could remain without heaviness. Eden noticed that Wyatt stayed in the kitchen longer after supper. Wyatt noticed that Eden did not withdraw when he entered a room. No one mentioned the marriage. No one asked why. Eden did not need to explain her place. She had defined it long ago. Wyatt did not ask for more than presence, perhaps because he understood that any pressure now would shatter the fragile rhythm they had just begun to build. One late evening, as Eden set her bowl down and stood, Wyatt watched her longer than usual, not with possession, but with the look of a man slowly learning to accept a new reality, that this woman had not come to fill a void, but to exist on her own terms. They were not yet husband and wife in the full sense, but the house had begun to remember them both, and sometimes that alone was enough for something else to quietly take shape. Pressure arrived without noise. It did not knock. It was already there in the mornings when Wyatt woke earlier than usual, and in the nights when he lay awake after the house had gone dark. The bank did not need to send another letter. The deadline shortened itself, tightening around each breath he took. Wyatt began rising before dawn. He went out to check the fences, studied the cattle, as if staring long enough might produce a new answer. By noon, he returned with eyes reddened from lack of sleep. At night, he sat at the wooden table, the oil lamp turned low pen moving across paper before stopping. The numbers did not change. They only repeated patient cold. Eden saw all of it. She did not ask right away. Not from fear, but because she understood that questions asked at the wrong moment only built higher walls. Eden waited as she had learned to wait for most things in her life until the surface cracked on its own. Wyatt stayed up later each night. Sometimes Eden had already gone to her room. Sometimes she remained in the kitchen wiping down the scarred wooden table. She heard the chair scrape softly, the pen set down, the breath he tried to hold back. No words were spoken, but the house began to carry a different tension. One night when Eden returned to the sitting room for water, she found Wyatt slumped over the table. Not fully asleep, just worn down enough that he could no longer keep his back straight. The lamplight fell across the open ledgers in front of him. Eden paused for a beat. Then she stepped closer. She did not touch Wyatt, did not call his name. She only pulled out a chair and sat across from him. The ledgers lay there as if waiting to be read. Eden opened the first one. Slowly. She read not like someone searching for mistakes, but like someone listening. One line led to the next. Dates, interest, fees that appeared, then vanished. Eden stopped, turned back a few pages, compared entries. Her brow tightened just slightly, not from confusion, but from clarity. The numbers told her a different story. Not the story of a man who had failed at his work, but the story of a trap designed without an exit, interest, layered upon interest, vague clauses, extensions, meant only to keep the prey alive a little longer. Wyatt stirred as Eden reached the final page. He lifted his head, took in the scene before him, and for a brief moment, everything in him drew tight. The silence stretched taut as wire. You shouldn't. His voice was rough, breaking off mid-sentence. Eden looked up. She did not flinch, did not apologize. She met his gaze steadily, calm enough that Wyatt could not finish what he had begun to say. She closed the ledger and rested her hand on its cover as if holding it in its proper place, not solely his anymore, but not yet hers either. When did you sign this clause? Eden asked. Her voice was even, neither accusing nor soft, just a question that required an answer. Wyatt opened his mouth, then closed it again. He straightened both hands flat on the table, the distance between them shorter than usual. For the first time since Eden had arrived, he did not look away. There was something in his eyes, not weakness, but recognition. 3 years ago, he said, when the drought dragged on. Eden nodded once. She opened the ledger again and pointed to a line. They knew. Wyatt followed her finger. He saw figures he knew by heart, yet heard her words as if for the first time. One beat of silence passed, then another. You thought it was bad luck, Eden continued unhurried. But this isn't luck. It isn't misfortune. It's structure. The word structure hung between them. Wyatt leaned back as if realizing that the wall in front of him was not one he had built, and that meant it might be taken apart. He did not say thank you. Eden did not wait for it. She closed the ledger once more and slid it back toward him. Not claiming it. Not retreating. Outside, the night remained still. But inside that house, for the first time, Wyatt did not feel as though he was facing the debt alone. Eden did not begin with advice. She began with questions. Short questions placed carefully, carrying neither pity nor blame. She asked about the timing of the debt, about the extensions, about fees that appeared and disappeared between the pages of the ledger. She asked like someone standing before a problem with missing pieces, someone who needed to see the whole table before setting a hand down. Wyatt responded the way he always had. First, by closing off, then by irritation, then by long stretches of silence. He said banks were not places for argument, that the terms had been signed, that this land did not belong to people who thought they could bend the rules with words. Eden listened to all of it. She did not interrupt, did not argue right away. She only nodded as if each thing he said were a variable that needed to remain in place. "I didn't come here to save you," she said at last, her voice steady. "I just want to know where you're tied down." The words stopped Wyatt short, not because they comforted him, but because they asked nothing of him. Eden made no promises. She did not step into the role of a rescuer. She stood there as an equal facing the problem and facing him. After a few days, Eden suggested meeting with the bank, not as an order, as an option laid on the table. Wyatt gave a dry laugh. He told her she did not understand how harsh this world was, did not understand how men in pressed coats stripped land piece by piece. He had tried, and he had failed. Eden did not argue. She only said, "Then let me try." The meeting took place under a hard midday sun. The bank office was cool, its wooden floors polished enough to reflect footsteps. The banker looked up as they entered. His eyes passed over Eden and paused only briefly, then returned to Wyatt, as if the woman beside him were nothing more than an expected accessory. Eden let it pass. She sat down, hands resting on her lap, not folded, not leaning back. When the banker began to speak, Eden did not interrupt. She waited until he repeated the same clauses in the even voice of a man who believed his position secure. Then Eden spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, steady, unafraid. She asked about the way interest had been calculated during the drought, asked about administrative fees that were never fully explained, asked why certain clauses appeared only after the contract had been extended. The banker hesitated, just a fraction of a moment. But Wyatt saw it. He saw Eden hold the man's gaze, not in challenge, not in appeal, simply present, forcing an answer, or at least care in the telling of one. The meeting did not end in victory. There were no immediate concessions. But when they stood to leave, Wyatt understood something clearly. For the first time, he was not the only one in that room trying to keep his footing. On the ride home, they spoke little, but their eyes met more often. No longer brief, avoiding glances. These looks stayed a moment longer, long enough to confirm that something had shifted. Eden did not show satisfaction. She did not ask what Wyatt thought. She kept observing, kept placing small questions where they belonged. Wyatt found himself no longer resisting as he once had, not because he was weaker, but because he was beginning to believe there might be another way to stand without bracing himself alone. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the table, Wyatt caught Eden looking at him, not to measure, but as if waiting for him to speak. He opened his mouth, then stopped. Eden did not press him. She waited. Respect does not form through grand words. It comes from being seen not as a burden to be rescued, but as a person capable of standing in the same fight. For Wyatt, that feeling was entirely new. The nights began to stretch longer, not because there was more work to do, but because neither of them was in a hurry to end them. The wooden table at the center of the house became the place they returned to each evening. The oil lamp was turned low, bright enough to read the lines on the page, not bright enough to hide the shadows on their faces. Eden sat across from Wyatt, turning each page of the ledger. Wyatt held the pen, writing down the figures she read aloud. No one led. No one followed. They worked like two people who had always known each other's rhythm, only now allowing it to show. Eden removed her gloves as the night deepened. She placed them neatly beside the lamp. Wyatt noticed her bare hands for the first time in the dim light, long, steady fingers, faint calluses in her palms. Not the hands of someone used to being cared for, but the hands of someone who had learned to hold on to what was easiest to lose. She read slowly, very slowly. When fatigue crept in, Eden paused, resting her hand on the edge of the table. Wyatt noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He said nothing. He only slid the kettle closer. Eden looked at him for a moment, then nodded. A small gesture no longer unfamiliar. The space between them narrowed in ways that could not be measured. Not because the chairs moved closer, but because silence was no longer a wall. It became an open space safe enough for both of them to breathe at the same pace. At times, Eden looked up and caught Wyatt watching her. Not intently, not with judgment, just watching as someone learning to recognize something that mattered. Wyatt usually looked away before the gaze could be named, but Eden did not retreat. She held her eyes there a moment longer, as if letting him grow used to the fact that he did not have to turn away. One night rain began to fall late. It tapped lightly on the roof, steady and unhurried. Eden reached a long passage, then stopped. She rubbed her wrist, tilted her head to one side. Wyatt noticed and set his pen down. "We can continue tomorrow," he said. His voice was low, without command. Eden shook her head slightly. "Just a little more." They worked until the words on the page began to blur. Eden's head lowered onto the table without her noticing. Not deep sleep, just the moment when the body could no longer hold itself upright. Wyatt stood slowly. He did not call her name, did not shake her awake. He watched her for a long moment, as if weighing something. Then he stepped closer, took the coat draped over the back of his chair, and laid it gently across her shoulders. The gesture was unhurried, careful, exact. When the fabric touched Eden's skin, Wyatt paused. His hand hovered, then adjusted the coat so it would not slip. It was the first time he touched her, not out of duty, not out of circumstance, not because of the word wife written on paper, only because she was there. And he did not want her cold. Eden stirred slightly, but did not wake. Her breathing remained even. Wyatt stepped back, sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table. The numbers before him no longer felt as sharp as they once had. In that moment, he realized the silence around him had changed. It was no longer isolation. It carried presence. The next morning, Eden woke when sunlight reached the edge of the table. The coat had slipped away, folded over the chair. She looked around. Wyatt stood at the stove with his back to her heating water. No one mentioned the night before. There was no need. But their eyes met for longer than usual. No awkwardness. No avoidance. The nights that followed took on the same shape. Work. Silence. A little closer each time. No one named what was changing, but both of them felt its rhythm, a slow, steady shift that could not be undone. And in that house, as the oil lamp was turned low each night, silence was no longer a sign of distance. It became the place where all that had not yet been spoken was allowed to rest and wait for the right moment to step forward. The rain began very late after the house had settled into the quiet of night. Not heavy, just steady drops tapping softly against the wooden roof like a long-held breath finally released. The oil lamp burned low. The table stood empty. The ledgers had been put away, yet their weight still lingered in the air. Eden stood near the window, watching the rain draw thin lines down the glass. She wore no coat. One hand rested against the cool wooden frame, as if she needed something solid to keep herself still. Wyatt sat behind her, his chair slightly turned, hands resting on his knees. The distance between them was small, but this silence was different from the nights before. It was thicker, heavier. "I'm afraid," Eden said first, without turning around. Her voice did not shake. It was simply low. Wyatt lifted his head. He did not interrupt. He did not move closer. He let the words remain where they were long enough that they did not turn into apology or defense. "I'm afraid I'm only a replacement," she continued. "A solution, a name to sign, a shape meant to fill the space of what was lost." She paused, drew in a slow breath. "I don't want to be something temporary in someone's life." The rain fell more evenly. Wyatt stood but did not close the distance. He placed a hand on the edge of the table as if steadying himself. "I'm afraid too," he said. "Nothing more at first." Then he went on. "Afraid of losing everything. Afraid that every morning I wake up I'll have to measure how much time I have left. Afraid enough that I forgot how to stand beside someone without feeling like I'm letting them down." Eden turned. The lamplight softened Wyatt's face. The tension he usually carried was gone. What remained was a tired man finally speaking what he had kept buried. No vows were offered. No sentence began with, "I will" or "you will." They both knew that words like that spoken now would be either too light or too heavy. Wyatt stepped closer slowly. Eden did not step back. When the space between them was small enough for their breath to meet, he stopped. He asked with his eyes, not with words. Eden nodded once, barely. The first touch came as confirmation, not possession. Wyatt's hand rested on Eden's shoulder, firm enough to steady her, light enough that she could move away at any moment. Eden placed her hand against his chest, feeling a heartbeat that was steady but deep, the rhythm of a man trying to believe he was not a burden. They kissed slowly. No urgency. No reaching for more than presence. Each pause was a question. "Are you still here? Do you want to continue?" Each time the answer was yes. Eden rested her forehead against Wyatt's shoulder. Her breath warmed, then evened out. He drew her closer, his arms closing like protection that did not need declaration. No one hurried. No one led. Intimacy unfolded the way it does between people who have learned over time that safety does not come from speed. When they lay beside each other, the rain was still falling. Eden turned toward Wyatt, her hand resting on his wrist, where the pulse was clear. Wyatt left it there, did not tighten his grip, did not pull away. He simply stayed. "No vows," Eden whispered. "No need." Wyatt answered. They did not promise forever. They did not name the future. But in that moment, both of them knew this much: they were no longer standing on opposite sides of fear. They were on the same side among those who chose to stay, even without knowing what tomorrow would bring. The night passed slowly. The rain thinned. The house held the warmth of two people who had placed their trust in the simplest way possible, not through words, but through being fully present. Morning arrived gently, as if unwilling to disturb whatever had settled into place during the night. The rain had stopped at some point before dawn, leaving behind only the familiar damp scent in wood and soil. Light slid through the window frame, not sharp, not hurried, touching the floor the way it does on days that no longer need to prove anything. Eden woke first. She lay still for a while, not to avoid anything, but to listen to the house. The faintest sound of wind. The wooden roof easing back after the rain. The warmth beside her remained steady, real. Eden did not turn away. She did not rise too quickly, as if she needed one more beat to be sure that what had happened was not a fragile dream that would dissolve if named. Wyatt woke later slower. He opened his eyes, noticed the light had shifted, then noticed Eden there. No one startled. No one reached for words to explain how to begin. They looked at each other briefly, but long enough to understand that nothing needed to be taken back. Eden sat up first, adjusted her clothes, tied her hair neatly. Familiar gestures returned, but without the old layer of defense. Wyatt rose after her and moved into the kitchen, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to do in the morning. He poured water into the kettle, set it on the stove, waited. Eden stood at the doorway, watching him do these small things, things that carried no mark of the night before, yet did not deny it either. When the water boiled, Wyatt poured 2 cups and set them on the table. He said nothing. Eden sat down, wrapped both hands around the warm cup, felt the heat spread slowly into her skin. They ate breakfast in quiet. Not the cautious kind of silence, but a silence that had been accepted. Wyatt passed the plate of bread. Eden took it, nodded slightly. Their eyes met more than once, not to measure, but to confirm that both of them were still here, that neither had stepped away. No one called the night a mistake. No one tried to give it a name. After breakfast, Wyatt put on his coat and prepared to go outside. Eden cleared the table, her movements unhurried. When Wyatt reached the door, he paused for a moment and turned back. "I'll be back early," he said. Not a promise, just a statement. Eden nodded. "I'll be here." The door closed. Not heavily, not with avoidance. Eden stood still for another moment, then returned to the table and opened the ledger. The numbers were still there. Reality remained unchanged. But the way she looked at it had shifted, not as a weight to be borne alone, but as work that could be set back into its proper place. Midday passed slowly. Eden moved between the kitchen and the porch, then back again. The house had not changed yet, something in the air had settled. When Wyatt returned, the sun was already high. He set his hat down and looked at Eden for a beat before speaking. No long greeting was needed. Presence was enough. By afternoon, they sat across from each other at the wooden table, the ledger open once more. No one mentioned the night of rain. But between each line, each pause, there was an unspoken understanding that they were no longer just 2 people sharing a roof because circumstances had forced them together. At one point, Wyatt slid a cup of water toward Eden. She took it. Their hands brushed lightly. Neither pulled away. The touch carried no heat, only calm, the kind that comes after one has stopped wondering whether they are allowed to stay. When evening fell, the oil lamp was lit again. Eden lifted her eyes and met Wyatt's gaze. He looked back without turning away. No further confirmation was needed. No explanation required. The morning after that night did not open into new vows. It simply placed them into the same rhythm, the rhythm of people who no longer treat what is fragile as something to deny. And sometimes Eden thought, as she closed the ledger, that quiet acknowledgement was the strongest foundation for whatever might come next. The meeting took place on a rare dry morning when the sun stood high but had not yet turned harsh. Eden arrived earlier than scheduled, not to gain advantage but to give herself time to set her breathing right. She stood in front of the bank building, hands in her coat pockets, back straight. There was no tension of someone asking for mercy, only the readiness of a person who knew exactly what she was about to say. Wyatt arrived a few minutes later. He took his place beside Eden without asking if she was ready. He had learned that the question was unnecessary. He gave a slight nod instead, a quiet confirmation that he was here and would remain here through whatever followed. Inside, the banker was already seated, files stacked neatly in front of him. He looked at Eden longer than he had last time, yet began. In the same familiar tone, the tone of a man who believed this meeting would be another repetition with an outcome already decided. Eden let him finish. She did not interrupt, did not correct. She listened, storing each phrase, each gap between clauses. When he stopped, Eden opened the folder she had brought and placed it on the table. "We can go straight to what matters," she said. Her voice was even no louder than necessary. "I want to clarify 3 points." The banker raised an eyebrow. Wyatt glanced at Eden, then at the papers. He did not feel the usual tightening in his chest. Only a strange, unfamiliar focus, as if for the first time this room was not a place where he had to defend himself. Eden began with the interest rate. She read the exact figure, the exact date it had been applied, and matched it against the original contract. She pointed out fees listed under different names that were in effect the same charge. She did not accuse. She placed the facts side by side and let them speak for themselves. The banker adjusted his glasses. He gave a thin smile and said this was standard practice. Eden nodded. Standard, she repeated, but not always valid. She moved to the second point. The extension clause during the drought, a clause that allowed the bank to alter interest calculations without full renewed disclosure. Eden cited the relevant text and highlighted the contradiction between the appendix and the main agreement. The air in the room shifted slightly. Not enough to call it tension, but enough to recognize that the balance had moved. Wyatt stood still, hands folded in front of him. He said nothing. But the way he stood had changed. He was no longer waiting for judgment. He was witnessing. The final point Eden raised was the least noticed clause, a single line near the end of the contract concerning debt restructuring when the asset was still being used productively. She did not read it aloud. She slid the copy across the table. "The ranch is still operating," Eden said. "Not at high profit, but enough to show this is not a dead asset." The banker fell silent. He looked down at the page, then back at Eden. This time his gaze did not pass over her. He asked a few questions, his voice altered, more careful, slower. Wyatt listened, and for the first time in years, he did not feel spoken for. Eden was not speaking on his behalf. She was speaking with him. Each time the banker turned to Wyatt, searching for the familiar weakness, Wyatt met the look calmly. No pleading, no defense. His presence was steady enough to require no reinforcement. The negotiation lasted longer than expected. There was no raised voice, no threats, only numbers being returned to their proper places. When the banker finally nodded, it was not total surrender, but it was a clear step back. The bank agreed to adjust the interest rate, to extend the term, to remove several fees that no longer stood on solid ground, not out of goodwill, but because the rules had been brought into the open. When they stepped outside, the sunlight was unchanged. There was no celebration. Eden released a quiet breath. Wyatt stood beside her and turned to look at her. "Thank you," he said, "not as a debt, but as recognition." Eden nodded. "We did what was right." On the road back to the ranch, Wyatt realized something with sharp clarity. He was no longer walking as a man backed into a corner. And Eden, the black woman who had once stepped down from a dust-covered wagon, had never come to be rescued. She had come to stand with him, steady and unyielding, at the very center of the hardest confrontation of all. The days after that meeting moved more slowly. Not because there was less work to do, but because Wyatt no longer felt chased by every passing hour. The ranch remained the same, the ground still hard fences, still needing repair, cattle, still requiring checks each morning. but something inside him had shifted, as if a weight had finally been set down where it belonged. Wyatt began to recognize an old habit of his carrying everything alone. Not because he believed himself better than others, but because he did not know how to share without feeling like he was failing. For years, he had mistaken endurance for strength. Eden did not push him to change. She did not revisit the negotiation. She did not speak of victory. She simply continued doing what needed to be done, reading the ledgers, recording figures, reorganizing what could be adjusted. When Wyatt asked, she answered. When he did not, she let things be. That quiet respect unsettled him more than any advice could have. One afternoon, Wyatt stood on the porch and watched Eden move about the kitchen light, resting on her shoulders. He realized he was no longer seeing her as the person who had pulled him back from the edge. He saw her as someone who had chosen to stay while everything was still uncertain. The thought gave him pause, not from fear, but from understanding how much that choice was worth. One evening as they sat at the table, Wyatt set his pen down earlier than usual. "What do you think?" he asked, then stopped as if testing something unfamiliar. "About expanding North Eden," looked up. She did not answer right away. She studied him as if confirming the question was real, that he was inviting her into the decision, not just the execution. Then she nodded slowly and spoke about risk, about seasons, about what might need another year of waiting. Wyatt listened, not defensively, not interrupting. He realized this did not weaken him, it steadied him. Small changes began to gather. Wyatt no longer avoided Eden's eyes when speaking about what frightened him. He admitted to sleepless nights, to moments when he thought it was too late to make things right. Eden did not dismiss those feelings. She simply remained there, a support that did not demand a name. One morning, as Wyatt prepared to head out, Eden handed him a small notebook. "I wrote down a few options," she said. "Not for you to follow, just to look at." Wyatt took it, his fingers brushing hers. Neither pulled away. The touch no longer startled him. It made him feel unguarded. He began to understand that Eden was not a solution for the ranch. She was a choice for his life. The difference mattered more than he had ever realized. Solutions could be replaced. Choices could not. Some nights, Wyatt lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the years behind him. About the times he had refused help because he believed he had to bear everything alone. About the moments he had stepped back when he should have stepped forward. Eden slept beside him, her breathing even. He turned his head and watched her, not touching, just looking. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that staying, truly staying, did not mean losing himself. The next morning, Wyatt said it aloud. Not long, not polished. "I'm learning," he said, "how not to do everything alone." Eden looked at him. She did not smile. She did not encourage. She only nodded as if she had already seen it. Trust does not arrive like a promise. It comes like a new habit practiced each day, when Wyatt asks, when Eden answers, and when both accept that choosing each other is not something to prove but something to live. The ranch did not recover through a miracle. It recovered the way all durable things do, slowly, steadily, without display. In the first days after the pressure of debt eased, there was no celebration. Wyatt still rose early. Eden still took her seat at the wooden table each evening. But something in their working rhythm had changed. No more patching. No more merely holding on. They were rebuilding piece by piece with intent. They began with the north fence, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Wyatt measured. Eden kept the notes. When a beam did not fit, Eden did not stand aside. She held the other end, her shoulder braced lightly against the wood, her focus steady. Wyatt realized he no longer found her presence unusual. Not as help, not as someone standing behind him, but as a natural part of the work itself. Small changes followed. A new path was cut to avoid a sinking stretch of ground. One field was left fallow this season, not forced into use, Eden proposed. Wyatt weighed it. Decisions were made not through sharp argument, but through listening. Sometimes Wyatt agreed. Sometimes he did not. Eden accepted both. That more than anything kept the respect between them firm. By evening, the house began to carry the mark of two people. Not through new things, but through how the old ones were used. The wooden table was shifted slightly so the light would fall more evenly. A few books Eden had brought found a place on the shelf. Wyatt's coat hung beside Eden's, no arrangement, no announcement. Just there. One afternoon, Wyatt stood on the porch watching the cattle move slowly beneath the sun. Eden stood beside him, arms folded loosely. Neither spoke. When Wyatt let out a long breath, Eden tilted her head just enough to ask without words. Wyatt nodded. That was enough. The ranch began to see visitors again. Not many. A few old acquaintances. A few traders who had once kept their distance. Eden did not retreat to the kitchen. She stayed at the table, listened, asked questions, spoke when needed. Wyatt noticed how the way they looked at Eden had changed. No longer curiosity. Now consideration, the kind reserved for someone seen as a partner. One evening, as Eden recalculated costs, Wyatt stood behind her watching the figures take clearer shape. He realized he no longer feared the pages. Not because they were easier, but because he was no longer facing them alone. This place looks different, Wyatt said, not pointing to anything specific. Eden glanced around. It isn't, she replied. It's just being used the right way. The words stayed with Wyatt longer than he expected. The season shifted slowly. Not a season of abundance, but enough to breathe. Enough to think one step ahead. Wyatt began to speak about the years to come, not with worry, but with planning. Eden listened, offered input, never pressed. She did not stand behind him to push. She stood beside him to look forward together. Some nights they sat by the fire with no ledgers, no numbers. Eden leaned back in her chair. Wyatt sat a little closer. No need to touch. No need to confirm. Familiarity had already found its place. A home is not rebuilt with wood and nails alone. It is rebuilt with new habits, asking before deciding, listening before pushing back, accepting that standing beside one another does not cost either person their place. When Wyatt looked at Eden now, he no longer saw a woman who had come because of circumstance. He saw the one who had helped him rebuild a rhythm of living, not through loud sacrifice, but through steady presence. And for Eden, this ranch was no longer a temporary refuge. It was a home being rebuilt in the truest sense, a place where she did not have to stand behind to be allowed to stay, and did not have to stand in front to prove anything. She only had to stand beside him. Time did not change the ranch overnight. It moved through the place the way wind follows a familiar path, slow, steady, leaving marks only for those willing to stay and look closely. Eden knew she was pregnant on a very early morning. There was no dizziness, no rush of excitement. Only the quiet certainty of a body shifting in a way that could not be mistaken. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, one hand resting on her stomach, breathing evenly. When Wyatt woke, she told him simply. He stood still for a few seconds, then nodded. No questions. No panic. He stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. A familiar gesture held a little longer this time. Wyatt cared for Eden in his quiet way. He rose earlier to take on the heavier work. He set warm water out each morning. When Eden grew tired, he did not tell her to rest. He rearranged the work so she would not have to push herself. No one called it sacrifice. It was simply a new rhythm settling into place, as natural as the way this ranch had learned to recover. As the months passed, Eden's belly grew. She still sat at the wooden table writing reading letters, balancing the books. Wyatt often stood behind her, watching the figures fall into better order than before. Some evenings he rested a hand on the back of her chair and said nothing. Eden knew he was there. That was enough. Their son was born on a quiet night, no rain, no wind. There were few people present, only low light and steady hands doing their work. When Eden heard the first cry, she closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. Wyatt stood beside her, holding her hand. No vows were spoken, but something had been set deep in place. They laid the child in a cradle Wyatt had built by hand, plain wood, solid, unpolished. Eden rested her hand on the edge and felt the small, steady breath. Wyatt watched the scene for a long time, as if learning something new, the way to stay without needing to control. The ranch continued to change, quietly, but clearly. Fields were planted again at the right seasons. A storage shed was repaired to hold food through winter. Eden proposed a rotating work schedule so no one was worn down. Wyatt agreed. Hired hands began to stay longer. They brought their families. The ranch was no longer just a place to work. It became a place people chose. 2 years later, Eden gave birth to a daughter. This time, Wyatt did not leave the doorway all night. When the child was placed in Eden's arms, she looked at Wyatt, no explanation needed. He bent down and touched his forehead to both mother and child very gently. Life grew busier, heavier too, but no one felt pulled under. Eden divided her time clearly. When she was with the children, work waited. When she worked, Wyatt stayed home. These choices were not debated. They were lived. The ranch provided work for more people, not through rapid expansion, but through doing things right. People came, stayed, then brought others. There was no need for announcement. Its reputation spread because those who left still wanted to return. In the afternoons, Eden sat on the porch, her son running at her feet, her daughter sleeping in her arms. Wyatt stood in the yard fixing a door, then looked up. There was no sense of having arrived, only the certainty that they were where they belonged. Legacy is not found in what is built high. It is found in what is held steady. This ranch, this home, did not begin with love. It began with no one being pushed out again. And over the years, that became the first thing people noticed when they passed through the gate, a place that allowed people to stay, to work, and to grow together. The house did not change much over the years, not in any way that would catch the eye of a stranger passing through. The porch remained low, its boards worn smooth where countless feet had stepped and paused. The old scratches in the wood were still there, left uncovered, not out of neglect, but out of acceptance. They were marks of use, of life lived without erasing its traces. Every morning the windows were opened, not because the air was stale, but because it had become a habit, a quiet greeting to the day. Wind moved through the rooms, freely lifting curtains, just enough to remind the house that it was not meant to be sealed off from the world. If there was one thing that had changed, it was the front door. It was rarely closed all the way, not from carelessness, but because this place had learned something subtle over time, that a home could remain whole without shutting others out. That leaving space was not the same as losing what one had. Eden noticed this one very early morning, long after the children had grown and the seasons had repeated themselves enough times to blur together. Light moved slowly across the valley, unhurried, as if it too had learned the rhythm of this land. Wyatt had already gone out, his footsteps blending into the familiar sounds of morning, the creak of wood, the distant movement of animals, the soft resistance of earth beneath boots. Eden stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand resting against the wooden frame. She listened to the house breathe. It had a sound, steady calm, unforced, a place that no longer braced itself against the world. The first person to arrive that season was a young man with a tired horse and clothes worn thin at the edges. He stopped at the gate, uncertain, as though unsure whether he had the right to be there at all. He did not call out. He did not knock. He simply stood, waiting for permission he did not know how to ask for. Eden walked toward him without haste. She looked at him not quickly, not suspiciously, but fully. Then she opened the door wider. She did not ask why he had come. She did not ask where he had been. She asked only whether he was hungry. That was enough. Others came one by one. Not in a rush, not all at once. A family needing shelter through a winter that promised to be longer than most. A widow looking for work, her hands strong, her eyes cautious. A boy who had learned too early how to make himself small, unaccustomed to being seen as a whole person rather than a burden. The house carried no sign, made no announcements. There were no rules written on the wall, no speeches offered at the door. It opened through action, not words. Chairs were moved to make room. Bowls were placed on the table without explanation. Work was offered, not demanded. Rest was allowed without shame. Wyatt saw it all. He was not surprised. He did not stop it. Some evenings he stood on the porch and watched Eden bring out another chair, set another place at the table. He did not ask how long they would stay. His eyes did not question her choices. They confirmed them. They had once stood on the outside themselves. They knew what it was to hesitate at a threshold, to wonder whether one more step would mean rejection. They knew how heavy it felt to carry one's need quietly, hoping it would not be noticed. And because they knew that feeling, they chose not to repeat it with others. Time passed, the way it always does without ceremony. Their son grew taller than Eden's shoulder. Their daughter stopped holding Wyatt's hand when she crossed the yard, though she still glanced back to make sure he was watching. Then one day, as children do, they left the ranch. Not abruptly, not dramatically. They left carrying habits rather than instructions, asking before taking, waiting, before judging, staying, when someone else needed another moment. Eden and Wyatt grew old together without noise. Eden's hair turned gray slowly. The silver did not replace the darker color beneath it. It blended in like light, passing through shade. Wyatt moved more carefully on his knees. Old pain reminded him to rise slowly, to choose his footing. No one complained. No one treated it as loss. It was simply time doing what time does. They sat beside each other more often now. On the porch in the late afternoon. By the stove when the evenings grew cold. Sometimes they spoke. Often they did not. Silence no longer meant distance. It meant comfort. On certain afternoons, the wind crossed the fields carrying fine dust, the same dust that had been there long before them. Eden would place her hand over Wyatt's. He would answer by keeping still, not gripping, not pulling away, a gesture enough to say, "I am here. I am not leaving." The ranch continued to run, not much larger than before, not grand, but steady. People came and went. Some stayed a long time, some only a season. But everyone who left carried the same feeling with them, even if they never named it aloud. They had been seen. One evening when the house had settled into quiet, Eden rose to close the door a little. Not fully, just enough to soften the draft. Wyatt watched from his chair and smiled faintly, not because of the door itself, but because he understood what it represented. The circle had closed. Not by exclusion, but by leaving space. Eden understood this better than anyone. Some families do not begin with love. They begin with the decision not to push anyone out again. When the lamps were put out, the house held its familiar warmth. Outside, the land remained harsh. Drought still came. Winters were still long. Hardship did not disappear simply because kindness existed. But this place was no longer hostile. It had learned how to receive one person at a time, one steady breath at a time. And so Eden stayed. Wyatt stayed, not to prove what had happened, not to protect a story, but to keep living with what had been chosen quietly, steadily, and wide enough for others to stay as well. Their story did not end with a great victory, nor with promises spoken loudly. It ended with mornings that still arrived slowly, with a door never fully closed, with two people who chose to stay day after day, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. And perhaps after enough years, people stop looking for a love that makes the heart race. They look for a home that does not require defense, a person beside them who does not ask for explanations why they are tired, why they are quiet, why they need more time. Eden understood this. Wyatt did too. Together they built a family that did not begin with romance but with decency, something far more enduring than any vow. If this story brings to mind someone you once knew or a season of your own life, then it has done what it needed to do. Some stories are not meant to end loudly. They are meant to stay.